you all again for being here. I know this webinar, it's a little bit different styled event, but we're very excited to have Kathleen Cue on today. If this is your first type of event with Conservation Nebraska, I just want to inform you that Conservation Nebraska is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that is across the whole entire state. We hold educational events to sort of try and upkeep the beautiful legacy that Nebraska has to offer. So if you want to follow and stay in tune with what we have going on right now, I posted our Facebook link in the chat, so that's a good way to stay up to date on our events and what kind of projects we have going on. But with no further ado, I would like to welcome Kathleen Cue. She's with the Dodge County, Nebraska Extension as the Horticulture Educator. Thank you, Kathleen.
Thank you, Dakota. So thank you all for attending today. I really appreciate your interest in pollinators, and there's a lot that we can do to help pollinators ourselves, and so I'll be talking about that a lot today. So it's interesting in that we did a eco fair for some 5th graders, and when we asked them about, why do we care about pollinators, they said so we can have more flowers. And that's sort of right, but it doesn't paint the whole picture. So I really want to paint the whole picture for you today about the importance of pollinators. And I don't know why I did that, but we'll do this. Okay. So, and just so that we're clear, we're talking about a lot more than honeybees and monarch butterflies. These 2 insects are kind of the rock stars of the insect world because everybody's aware of them. They're aware of their plight, but I'm going to be introducing a lot more insects to you. Also benefit us because they're pollinators. So we'll be talking about a lot more. So, okay. So why do pollinators need plants? Well, they need it for several reasons. So in this image in the lower left here, we can see that there's nectar dropping from the flower, and that's one thing that they need for sure. Nectar is a sugar source, a carbohydrate, and so it's providing part of their diet. And then in the upper right image here, we have pollen just literally covering this bee. And pollen is a protein source. And so that's going to be an important part of their diet as well. And I just want to pause here a little bit and explain how important it is for the progeny, for the eggs that these insects lay. So a lot of times the female will make something called a pollen nectar ball. And that consists of nectar and pollen in the amounts needed for good nutrition and health of that particular egg when it hatches. So pollen and nectar play a role not just in the health of the adult insects, but then of the larvae as well as they develop. In this image here of the hollow stem, we can see that, let me go back. We can see the hollow stem that's occurring from just a lot of plants have hollow stems, or they develop that hollow stem as they age through the season. And that's very important for cavity nesting pollinators like the bees, the native bees. And then the lower image here of the leafcutter bee cutting out sections of the leaves, a lot of these native bees separate the pollen nectar ball and the egg one from another because there is a certain amount of predation they'll do on each other if there's not enough food. And so the female wisely puts plant material of some type from one nectar pollen ball and egg combination to the next. So what's wrong with this image? Okay, the problem ultimately is that it's too sterile, that there's not enough going on there as far as flowers go in order to provide that nectar and pollen that's necessary for good insect health. And so these landscapes in particular, where they're almost cookie cutter in their approach, where they have the requisite, red maple and river birch and a few spirea, maybe even a few boxwoods, that really isn't enough diversity to do them any real good. And so we're going to talk a lot about plant materials here that's going to impact them. Also, there's a lack of nesting sites here. You know, there's lawn covering every square inch of space here. And that's going to be an important factor too for the ground nesting bees. Okay. The really cool thing about pollinators is that this is something that we can all have a positive impact on. So we know that the whales are in trouble, we know that the polar bears are in trouble, but those represent distant things that we can contribute towards, but not anything necessarily we can do in our own backyard. And there's a study done at the University of Missouri that gave us a resounding yes, that any size thing that you do to help pollinators is going to be a beneficial thing for them. And so from the balcony garden with one container all the way to a pollinator garden that's, you know, an acre or more, those all benefit because they all add to that cumulative effort in order to benefit them. So we want to create pollinator hot spots within our yards. And this is where we have things that are in flower to benefit them. But in the background here, you can see that there's a bath that's going to benefit them as well. And I'm going to talk about the importance of bare soil. And bare soil is also a key component of hotspot because there's actually two things that go on there. So the native bees, 2/3 of them roughly, like to lay their eggs in their ground nesters. And so the access soil is going to be important. And then for butterflies, it's important as well. Butterflies do something called puddling. And this is when, as water evaporates from the soil, it brings minerals up towards the soil surface. And those minerals are important to the diet of a lot of butterflies. And so you'll see them in those areas where water is evaporating, sponging up those minerals to have better health. And so access to soil is an important component of a pollinator hotspot. So let's talk first about plant selection because that is the biggest component of any kind of pollinator garden. And so we're going to talk a lot about different things here. And when we're talking about plants, a lot of times what the conversation goes towards is native plants. And the thing is that we don't want to stay with just Iowa native plants or just Nebraska native plants or just South Dakota native plants, because butterflies and native bees don't know about boundary lines. Those are political lines. We want to think instead in a larger way as to regions. We want to think regionally when we're planting a lot of these native plants in order to benefit them. Okay, and one thing I want to make clear, a lot of times when we're thinking about benefiting pollinators, automatically we go to wildflowers and flowers of any kind. But we don't think of the larger thing is that every plant is on the table as being a potential benefiter to pollinators. And so we're going to look at trees, we're going to look at shrubs, we're going to look at wildflowers, of course, because we're very familiar with them being a benefit. But a lot of things that people don't think of as vegetable plants. I mean, not only do we need them to pollinate flowers for us so that we get those vegetables, but we're also benefiting them as well in providing nectar and pollen. Definitely fruit trees are a big benefit to us as well as them. And then we need to think about a lot of the herb plants are beneficial to the larval stage, the caterpillar stage of some of our butterflies. Now grasses, why would grasses, you know, these are flowers that really don't provide much in the way of benefit, but a lot of grasses have hollow stems. And those hollow stems are something that the cavity nesting bees can use to lay their eggs in. So grasses play a role as well. And then bulbs, the benefit of a lot of bulbs, and I'm not talking about the tulips and daffodils so much, but the other type of early spring blooming flowers, because that's some of our earliest sources of nectar and pollen for these guys as they're emerging from the winter. So this particular plant is called Quamish, And that particular plant is an early bloomer that comes up from a bulb. Good old weeds. You know, a lot of times I encounter people with lawns that really long for that aesthetic of the perfect weed-free lawn. And if that's your approach as well, there's nothing wrong with that. But if you want to help out the pollinators a little bit, maybe devote a portion of your yard to just having some weeds come up. So we're talking about clover and dandelions, to just let them have an early food source as well. And now let's talk about double flowers versus single flowers. Okay, single flowers are just basically one set of petals. It's very clear to see where the center of the flower is, so the insect can hone in on where the nectar and pollen is located. The problem with this image on the left here is that these are all stacked petals. And those, when a lot of these hybrids are usually produce less nectar and pollen because of this particular trait. And also, if you have problems seeing the center of the flower, more than likely they do as well. So these aren't a good choice. If you do have to have double flowers, make them just a few. Instead, add lots more of the single flowers, okay? Then we want to look at plant selection that we're looking at both the adult and the larval stages, okay? So in this case, when we're looking at butterflies and bees, we're talking about siphoning or sponging or sucking mouth parts. And so the type of things that we see done to these flowers is really not anything in the way of any kind of cosmetic damage. We just don't see anything really going on. On the other hand, when it comes to the caterpillar or the larval stages of a lot of these insects, they have chewing mouth parts. They're physically removing away that plant material. And so you would expect to see damage like the swallowtail caterpillar on the flatleaf Italian parsley, because they're sitting there chewing away at it. It's disappearing. And I'm telling you this because I had a woman that called one time and asked about, you know, what to do in situations like this, because she was killing all of these caterpillars, totally oblivious to the fact that that gave rise to the swallowtail butterfly. And so you can plant an extra plant just for the caterpillars. And if they show up on the ones that you want to eat, it's really a matter of herding them to the plant that you want them to feed on. So you can gently break off a leaf from your plant and nestle it into the plant that you want them to feed on, and let them complete their life cycle on the one that's strictly for them. So just be aware that those kind of things can occur, okay? Then I want to talk a little bit about generalists versus specialists. Okay, generalists are those feeders where just about anything will do. Any kind of plant that is producing a flower is going to provide them some of the things they need. But also in the pollinator world, we have specialists, and those are the insects that need one type of pollen or one type of nectar to complete their life cycle. And so it's good to have plants that benefit both the generalists, the ones that will take anything that's out there, and the specialists who need that just to complete their life cycle. So the important thing to remember about this is that some of the research that's been done in Nebraska is that the vast majority of our native bees are generalists when it comes to nectar. So again, just about any kind of nectar will do. But when it comes to pollen, the protein source, many of them are specialists. And so this is another idea to reinforce that we need to have that variety in our landscape so that we can fill the bill needs. And then in this lower image here, we can see a nectar pollen ball. And again, this is nectar, the sugar source, pollen, the protein source. And then there's a little bit of saliva that the female puts with that nectar pollen ball. And the saliva has a purpose. It's actually there to kind of glue everything together, but it's also she imparts certain immunities to her offspring when they eat that. So there's a benefit there as well. Okay. So we're looking at 3 seasons of color. We want things in the spring, summer, and fall so that we're really catching all of those as they emerge. A lot of times our plants focus on fall because that's when the pollinator numbers are at their highest, but it's equally important to have the other 2 seasons covered because a lot of times as these insects are emerging from their pupal cases, first thing in the spring, one of the first things on their mind is eating. And so having those early bloomers like this bloodroot going is going to be important. And then I have some other images here of just some other early blooming flowers. And so the anemones are going to be important to these insects on the left. Okay. And when I'm talking about geraniums, I'm not talking about the bedding plant geranium that's common in our garden centers this time of the year. What we're talking about is the perennial geranium, sometimes called cranesbill. This is a native plant that benefits them because it, well, number one is native plants tend to be more beneficial than our other plants. But this is something that we can do to definitely benefit them. And again, you can see the number of bees and flies that benefit from this plant. Goat's beard. So this is one that is, we really don't think of as being necessarily a pollen or nectar source because it's not a classic flower, but it's another early bloomer that's going to help them out. And again, you can see that there's a lot of bees, beetles, wasps, flies that are all benefiting from having this plant blooming. Okay. Coreopsis and Gaillardia, again, a couple of plants that are ones that really benefit from those pollinators. The green bottlefly, the one on the left, is one that we don't necessarily think of as a pollinator because it's a fly, but it is beneficial. So it's a pollinator. And then we have the bumblebee on the right. And then we have rattlesnake master, again, kind of an unexpected native plant that's going to benefit pollinators. And then on the right here, we have the Michigan lily. And let me just share a little bit of something about that. So just because it says Michigan lily doesn't mean it's a regional plant. It just means that when this plant was named, the researcher was in the area of Michigan at the time. And so that doesn't mean that it's not native to this area as well. It is. And so this is something that we could be planting. Solomon seal, a beautiful shade-loving plant that we can really use to boost our shady areas, is a good thing to use. And then the Asclepias, any of the milkweeds are going to be a benefit to the monarchs. And then as we move into the later part of the growing season, we can look at things like turtlehead, the one on the left. Again, a little bit of an unexpected type of flower for a native plant. And turtlehead has some tolerance to shade. So this is another good one to use in those areas where you have maybe a little more shade than you want and you think that you can't plant a pollinator garden. Well, you can. And then the Agastache, also known as licorice mint. And all of our mints are going to be real butterfly attractors as well as native bees. Boltonia, this is what I think of as the classic style of flower when I think of native flowers. The one on the left and then the one on the right, boneset, another unexpected flower that we can put into our sites. And then the gray-headed coneflower. Not only do the flowers provide some nutritional value to our pollinators, but the seeds in these provide benefit to birds as well. And then ironweed, another unexpected native wildflower that's going to benefit them. What's really critical when we're planting these is we want to group like plants together. The reason for that is as these guys are feeding and it's a food source they can have, it gives them lots of opportunity to browse that entire area or that entire planting. So group the plants together wherever you can. Again, more groupings. And one interesting bit of research that I found on benefiting monarch butterflies when you're planting milkweeds is that whenever you can place the milkweeds towards the edge of the garden, not in the dead center, but towards the edge, they can find the plant more readily. And the research indicates that when they're located near the edge of the garden, there'll be a higher number of both larvae and adults on those plants than there will be than if they're centered in the garden. And so, and it's also important that not a lot of big tall plants kind of overshadow that particular milkweed plant. So keep things a little shorter around the milkweed and keep them towards the edge to really benefit the monarchs. So that's a whole bunch that I just talked about in when it comes to plants, but water is an important component as well. So here we see that there's honeybees are lined up almost like, you know, little piglets along the trough. They're all sponging away at getting that water from there. And so water is an important part of a pollinator hotspot. And when we use something like a bird bath, which is absolutely fine, it's important that we have something that they can stand on while they're getting that water, because they're not very good at sitting on the edges of our bird baths and getting the water they need. So gravel, sand, or even large stones are all a benefit as far as helping them being able to get the water they need without drowning. And I had mentioned earlier about how honeybees and monarchs are kind of the rock stars of the plant or of the insect world, but really we're talking about so much more than that, just because well, I'll talk a little bit about that in a bit, but with the domesticated honeybees, what we're looking at are things like this blue orchard mason bee. I mean, isn't this a gorgeous bee? And it's a solitary bee, so it lives out its life, not in a communal setting like honeybees and bumblebees do, where each one has a job. But instead, what they're doing is they're living out their lives pretty much on their own. They're cavity nesters, so they're gonna like the hollow areas of things. And they're important pollinators of fruit crops, very important pollinators of fruit crops. So that's a really good thing. And you see them most in the springtime. So this is important to have some of those early flowers just to benefit those guys. Flies. Flies are something that we don't think of necessarily when it comes to being good pollinators, but they are. In fact, they're the second most important of all of them. So it's really important that if we see them, we don't necessarily think they're a nuisance. And they're important to crops like carrots and onions and strawberries to really get those productions that we need. And then we don't think of alpine plants as needing a pollinator, but these guys are more likely to go in the higher altitudes and pollinate these plants. So again, if you want to have a rock garden space with alpine plants, that's going to be a real benefit to these guys. So just to give you an idea of why these guys are important, we have to talk about agriculture. And it's a pretty big number that we're looking at for annual global food production, $235 to $577 billion worth of annual food that we're getting from this. And that's roughly 1/3 of our food supply. So if you think of it as taking a bite, it's every third bite that we're taking is benefiting us because a pollinator pollinated something. So they're pretty critical to us being able to eat. And when we look at the pollination of all flowering plants, roughly 80% of them need a pollinator to move that pollen about in order to get good seed production. And then 75% of our fruits, nuts, and vegetables. So all of those things are important to us. Native bees are good pollinators. They're very efficient at what they do. And so they make honeybees work a little harder for their food. It makes them, they're competing a bit. But the thing is that our native bees are excellent pollinators. And when we look at this, just 250 native bees do the work of roughly 30,000 or 2 hives of honeybees. We can see just how efficient they are. And so maybe at some point in the future, it won't be necessary for honeybee owners to move their hives around the country in order to benefit those crops in their pollinating season. And so this would be great if we could get more native bees into those. And I was talking to an entomologist about this, and he was sharing that they think they're about 10 years out from being able to have native bees in high enough populations in certain orchard areas to really benefit them like they need to, that the honeybees are providing now. The really fun thing about bee names is that they get their names from some trait of theirs. So, you know, they don't really have necessarily real glamorous names, but it really explains a lot about what they're doing. So one on the upper left here, leaf cutter bee, is one that it's kind of cool to watch it because it cuts the leaf tip with its mouth and then it just rotates in a circle and it gets these amazing little half-inch circles of leaf tissues. And this is used to divide the egg and the pollen nectar ball combination one from another so that they don't feed on one another. And so you'll hear me talk a lot about what those divisions are between those different eggs. So the Carter bee, so that's the one on the right, upper right here. And the Carter bee is one that gets its name. So the old-fashioned term for when you carded wool, when you strung out wool, when you got wool ready for weaving it into yarn, is that was carding. And so what these bees do is they go to plants with fuzzy leaf hairs on them. So things like lamb's ear and mullein, those are plants that they can readily card those hairs off of and use them to separate their eggs. The carpenter bee gets its name from the fact that it likes to nest primarily in wood. And so it's able to chew wood away with its mouth and nest into those spaces. Excuse me, let's go back to the squash bee. So the squash bee represents a success in that the squash bee, when is a native bee that primarily fed on the native squash that grew on this continent. But with the advent of more of the domesticated squash that we now grow, so things like cucumbers, zucchini, yellow crookneck, and all of those different types of squash, this bee has now transitioned to those domestic crops. So this insect was successful at moving from strictly native squash plants to now the things that we grow ourselves. So the wannabes are the ones that aren't bees. We don't think of them as pollinators, but they are. So things like wasps and moths are definitely pollinators as well. This is the soldier beetle. And I think if I had a nickel for every time during the season when people were calling me because their plants are just covered in soldier beetles, I would probably be very well financed right now, because these guys, people get alarmed when they see them. And really what they're doing is they're collecting pollen. They're called soldier beetles because their wing coverings, which are called elytra, look like shields, and so hence soldier beetle. And then of course butterflies. I mean, they're like flying flowers themselves. They're really quite beautiful in the landscape, add a wonderful dimension, and they're pollinators too. So Dr. Natalia Bjorklund has been doing a lot of research on native bees of Nebraska. And I'm including this slide because clearly it's easy to see like the bumblebees that are in this. They're the big insects in this display, but there's some here that you would never guess in a million years are native bees, mostly because they look like tiny ants with wings on them. But instead, they're pollinators, they're native bees, and they're doing the work, well, they're doing yeoman's work as far as doing things very well. So there's a lot of insects there that may not even rise on your radar screen as being something that is a native bee, but is. And these are the guys that we're mostly tuned into for helping. Okay. Dr. Gail Langoletto has talked a lot about native bees. And one of the things that she's really talks about is that when we're creating these pollinator hotspots, we need to think about nesting sites for the native bees as well. Okay, so one of the things that the ground nesting bees need is access to soil. And so this is where your tidiness as a gardener is going to be a little bit challenged, because a lot of times we want to have mulch on every bit of bare ground. It keeps the soil cooler, it keeps down weeds, it looks nicer. But the reality is that we need a few of those bare areas just to benefit these guys. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the activity of the ground nesting bees versus the activity of yellow jacket wasps. So some people confuse these two. So on the left, you can see that this tunnel system's been created by this bee. And what she does is she has one pollen nectar ball at the end of each of those tunnels. Okay, so that's her separation for them. And that's going to be something that you only see one adult arising from. Okay, whereas the one on the right, the yellow jacket wasp, there's a huge nest underground, and you will see multiples of these guys moving in and out all throughout the day. So this is something that can help you decide whether you're looking at a bee nest or a yellow jacket nest. The research indicates that when we're putting down those bare areas to benefit the ground nesting bees, one of the things that we need to look at is the incline. So all the way from horizontal to completely vertical, we can see bees will make use of those spaces. So whatever space you can devote towards a bare area is going to benefit, and it doesn't matter if it's sloping or not, okay? So what we're looking at here on the left is we can see that there's a pupal case there with an insect inside of it, and it's changing, it's molting, it's getting ready to emerge on the right as a bumblebee. So very important that we have that access to soil so that that life cycle is completed. One cool thing that we can do if we really don't want to have those completely bare areas of mulch everywhere is we can utilize ground covers. Ground covers have a really nice way of spreading over the soil, but insects can still get through those plants to the ground below and do that digging that they need to create those nesting cavities. So ground covers are an excellent way if you're not using mulch. All right, so this image on the upper left here, I want to point out, because what we can see here is that division that I was talking about of plant material with an egg and nectar ball pollinating cube, not cube, but ball that they need to put together, okay? And the interesting thing about our cavity nesting bees is that they will utilize the hollow centers of plants in order to do this. And the female, when she's laying her eggs, always chooses a spot that's open on just one end of that tube. And I'll talk about more when I talk about pollinator hotels. But when you're looking at the hollow centers of a lot of our plant materials, she's creating that open area on one end by boring into that particular stem. And she can choose the gender of her eggs, and she will put the female eggs furthest into that particular tube. and gradually move to where she's putting male eggs towards the outside of that tube. And there's a twofold reason why she's doing that. The first is that she wants it so that when the females finally emerge, and so the first one laid is the last one out, that she wants it so that when the females emerge, the males are ready and to mate with the females. The other reason for that is that the eggs that are located at the outermost end of that tube are more prone to predation. And so she will voluntarily let some of the male eggs be sacrificed in order to protect the female eggs, the reproducers, as the next generation. One important thing I want to mention about these plant materials is it's really important that we not be too tidy in the fall as we're removing all of this plant material from the site, because there could be pollinators that have laid eggs in those hollow stems. And you don't want to just cut them back by half, because then water is allowed into those stems. So it's really about waiting until spring, early summer before we cut a lot of these things back. And when in doubt, you can always cut one stem and look to see if there's any pollinators in there, if there's any eggs in there, because you can see from this image what that would look like. So I had mentioned pollinator hotels. These are human constructed hotels that we can have insects in. And the size of the hole and the depth of that hole will determine what insect will utilize that space for egg laying. Again, it's important that the back side of those holes are not open to the air or whatever, that these holes that are drilled into these blocks do not go all the way through. That's critical, because if it's open on both ends, the female will not lay her eggs in those areas. And sometimes we have to be careful about the size of the pollinator hotels. And so these are better sizes, just like hospitals are kind of a gathering place or a conglomeration of disease problems for humans. So is true for pollinator hotels for insects. We don't want to get them too big. And so staying on the smaller side is going to be a benefit to them from the disease perspective. You know that you have pollinators that have put eggs into those when you start seeing bits of plant material coming out of those. And you can actually see some of these have, you can see like right here that there's something that's emerged from that already. So you know that that particular hotel has been utilized. And so that's something that you can keep in mind too. These are the nice part when there are different components like that is as they get used and it gets hard to clean them out, you can toss those blocks out and add new blocks to the site. And that's a really handy way of keeping those clean. So a lot of times if there's a bit of debris sticking out, you can always run your drill through those and pull that excess debris out of there. And over time, what you'll notice is that those may be really, really hard to clean out. Nobody's using that particular area anymore, and that's when it's nice to pull those blocks and toss them. Now, when you're utilizing shelter, so this is just good old pallets and bricks put together to make a pollinator hotel, it's important that we have some way to shed the water. So you can see the clay tiles at the very top of this. These will help shed water from this particular structure, because if there's a lot of moisture that gets into these tunnels, then it's going to be a problem for them as far as surviving. There's an excellent NEB guide that's on this, Creating a Solitary Bee Hotel. This is a fact sheet that talks about all the different native solitary bees that are out there and what size holes that you need for the hotel, as well as the depth of those holes in order to make them good homes. And so this is a good starting place. It makes a great 4-H project, kid project, and it tells about, you know, when you're placing them, what direction they need to face. They need to face towards the sun so that they really warm up nicely for the insects who don't have a way to heat themselves. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about pesticides just because we're familiar with insecticides. If we're spraying it on flowers and the pollinator comes along and visits that flower, they accidentally ingest it or touch it, it gets into their bodies and it kills them. But we want to look at all pesticides, so also herbicides and fungicides, because these products can cause erratic behavior. And when I say erratic behavior, they may figure out, they may not remember how to eat, they may not figure out where home is. It has a more profound effect on them than we give them credit for. So keep in mind that we need to be very cognizant of the pesticides we're using. And there's really no such thing as a non-toxic product. You know, these products are toxic for a reason. They're meant to kill something. And so even the low impact products like insecticidal soaps can cause problems if we're not being wise as to the timing of this. So if we're wanting to really not cause any problems, we can use just plain old water to rinse things down. That's going to be a benefit. And really what we want to practice is something called IPM, Integrated Pest Management. And that's the approach where we're looking at, do we have a problem? Has it reached a level where it's actually damaging the plant to where it can't recover from this? Then those are action steps or thresholds that you can then make that next step. But wholesale applying of an insecticide just because doesn't make sense. And then one cosmetic damage from really true damage to the plant. So, you know, the Japanese beetles feeding on our roses, it makes the roses look really ugly. It's hard to sit there and look at this terrible thing happening. And so maybe this is an instance where we choose our battles and we decide to not do some spraying so that when those pollinators come along, they're not affected by whatever is used to kill the Japanese beetles. And we may want to go to a method that collects the Japanese beetles by knocking them into a bucket of soapy water. That's a real simple thing to do. Okay. If you haven't heard of this, I hope that you'll consider applying. The Nebraska Certified Pollinator Habitat Program is really what we want to do to get the conversation started about what it takes to make a pollinator hotspot in everyone's yard, in everyone's balcony, in everyone's front porch to really benefit them. And so not only is this linked to an actual list, a plant list for spring, summer, and fall blooming plants, but it's an actual application itself. And so you can use this big long address up here, or if you look at our sign down here, it's go.unl/pollinators. And it's, even if you don't apply to the program, this plant list is excellent. And it's really good about pointing out other management practices. So the things that I mentioned today about water, weeds, and pesticide use, these are all things that we need to look at too when it comes to benefiting pollinators. And then it talks about the good conservation practices. You know, are we mulching everything inside, or are we leaving some bare spaces for the different native ground nesting bees? So that's something to keep in mind as well. I want to give a shout out to my colleague Scott Evans, who together we've collaborated to put this PowerPoint together. We're both on the Nebraska Certified Pollinator Habitat team, and we look at this as a benefit to the entire state as far as doing something to benefit the health of our ecosystem. Are there any questions? Yeah, the name of the bulb was Quamash, Q-U-A-M-A-S-H. That was the bulb that I featured here. When we're looking at pollinator bulbs, again, I mentioned that tulips and daffodils aren't really the ones that we're looking for as far as benefiting pollinators. These are classified as the lesser bulbs, the bulbs that really aren't on people's radar. So we're talking about gray hyacinths, crocus, Siberian squill, glory of the snow, these kind of off the beaten path, early spring blooming bulbs. When it comes to finding plants that benefit pollinators, you can certainly start them from seed. That's an excellent thing to do as far as getting many of our native plants. I was involved with a big pollinator project in Tacoma, Nebraska, where we put in a pollinator education garden. And it's a huge site. It's 100 feet by 85 feet. And some of the plants that were on the plant list that we wanted to include, we could only get from like native plant societies, or we had to order seeds, or we actually utilized the help of the Endangered Species Lab at the Henry Dorley Zoo for some of the plants that we did. So wherever, in some instances, the only way you're going to get some of these plants is by seed and starting them yourself. And there's a lot of information out there about how to start the seeds, you know, whether they need a cold period or whether they need to be in a moist area or a dry area. Do they need light to germinate? And follow those very well, because that's going to give you the answers you need as about growing that plant successfully. What's the best way to do this as far as starting things from seed? Trial and error, school of hard knocks. Some of these seeds can be a challenge. I won't kid you. There'll be a challenge to grow. But the thing about some of these harder to find plants is that it benefits many of the specialist pollinators out there. And so just because it's hard to find doesn't mean that you shouldn't grow it. But if you join like a native plant society, and I know there's several of them where you can get access to some of these seeds, that's going to be a real benefit to you, and it's going to be lower cost as well. What's my guidance on the use of a pre-emergent herbicide like preen? So preen isn't going to impact our pollinators as much. What the preen does is it sets up a chemical barrier in the top inch or so of soil, so that seeds, as they germinate, come in contact with that herbicide and they die. And this all occurs below the soil line. You never see the preen actually going to work. It's just going to be something that you see there. And so the good part is that it doesn't necessarily affect pollinators. That's a good thing. But in the relation to you know, the post-emergence herbicide that we're spraying on weeds, and then we're having a pollinator come and visit that clover plant, that post-emergence herbicide could technically affect that insect. So be aware of that, that it's really the post-emergent, not so much to the pre-emergence. The question is, I have many pine trees. What plants, flowers are best for trees in this type of soil or by the pines? So I'm going to give you a quick soil lesson here. Our soils are very alkaline in nature, and plants do best in soils that are slightly acidic in nature. So these pine needles that are dropping to the ground do not pose a problem as far as growing things underneath them. So there's any kind of plant that we have that's a native plant, not necessarily native, but a flowering plant that does well in shade is going to be a benefit, and you can grow those in shade. So hostas aren't native, but they have excellent flowers that really benefit the pollinators, and so they're going to do really well in those shadier areas. Where can I get a list of native plants for pollinators? You're gonna find this on the list, and so that link I have, let me go back real quick. It's not letting me go back. So it's go.unl.edu/pollinators. That's access to the Nebraska Certified Pollinator Habitat Program. And in that, you'll have a list. And that list is a very extensive list of spring, summer, and fall blooming plants. And there'll be a lot of native plants that are listed on there. Is this webinar available to view again? Yes, we're recording this. So once we have this recorded, Dakota can make it available to us so that if you want to view it again or do a pause over certain things I said, that's something that you'll be able to do. I'm having trouble getting coneflowers established. Can you give me some varieties that will do well in sandy soil? I live in zone 4. So zone 4 hardiness isn't a problem for coneflowers. They're tough as nails. They're going to handle it just fine. What they're not going to handle so well is that sandy soil. And so incorporating some compost into the site is going to be a real benefit, and it's going to greatly expand the number of plants that you can grow in that site. So if you can do compost or any kind of well-aged manure or something like that into that site, not only is it going to have better water holding capabilities, but it's also going to have a better buffer to those deep temperature drops that occur during our winters. So when we have a day that drops to 30 below and we sandy soil, that temperature develops deeper into those sandy soils than it does into a clay soil. And so having that organic matter to really act as a buffer is going to be beneficial there. And then mulching the plants in the wintertime is also going to provide a little bit of a buffer for those coneflowers to get established. So it's working with what you have. And once you have that colony started, then over time, they'll be able to seed themselves and expand that planting. What are the top 5 pollinator plants for Nebraska? Oh, this is a tough one for me to answer because I don't want to see people just use the formulaic approach of just doing the same 5 plants over and over again. Because remember, we have generalists, which is fine. The 5 plants for generalists is fine. But then we have specialists. And so we need all those plants out there. Somebody be doing something of that. So even if you're a neighborhood association and you want to apply to be a certified pollinator habitat as a neighborhood, even within that neighborhood association, if there's a variety of things, that's going to be beneficial. So there's a lot of native plants that's going to be a real boon. So I think that Rudbeckia is just a really tough plant that you can use that's native, that's going to do turtlehead. I love the unconventional flowers of that potential plant. And then a lot of our herb plants are going to be a real benefit to them as well. So any kind of herb is going to be in that top 5. When it comes to early blooming, I really am a big fan of the lesser bulbs. So the things like crocus and gloria of the snow and Siberian squill, those are all unexpected early bloomers that's going to help tremendously. And then the 5th, I think, is going to be my vegetable plants. I'm an avid vegetable garden. I know they're benefiting them as well. And so those would be kind of my top 5. I recently heard iris and daylilies aren't that good for pollinators. Yes, you are correct. They aren't that great for pollinators. There are some irises that have bees that visit them. Not so much daylilies. You really don't see much in the way of those. So you can definitely plant these things because they do develop hollow stems over the winter or as we get towards winter. And so that would be a potential site for them to lay eggs in those stems. But that also means that you can't clean up the site until spring. So that's a consideration as well. So maybe keep the iris and daylilies so that they don't dominate your entire garden, and add in some of these other things. How many water stations are needed? 1 is fine. 1 is absolutely fine. And you saw that image I provided of the bird bath with a large rock, gravel, and sand. You can do all 3 of those. And you're going to want to check that water and refresh it as needed. And the benefit to that is that you'll get birds that use the space as well. So a lot of win-wins when you put out a water station. Would you consider praying mantises as a pollinator? No, they are not pollinators. They are beneficial in the sense that they are eaters of other insects, so they are a predator of other insects, and so it's nothing wrong with having praying mantises in the garden, but they're not necessarily a good pollinator insect. Can you recommend plants that will survive along a city street? I'm slowly trying to convert the space between my sidewalk and the street to include more flowers. I have a corner lot. One street gets salted in the winter, the other does not. I'd like plants that are not too tall, under 2 feet, so that people can still see around the corner. That's a really good question, Sarah. And that space between the sidewalk and the street, we typically call that the inferno strip, just because it's incredibly hot from all that paved surface area. And then on top of that, a lot of times you'll have salts that go down on those streets during the winter months. And so when you're looking at plants that do well in those spaces, my number one go-to plants are the Mediterranean plants. And the Mediterranean plants are our herb plants. Things like sage and thyme, and a lot of the mints will have fuzzy leaves, and that fuzzy leaves not only helps them to weather those hot spaces, but it physically keeps the salt off of their leaves during the winter months. So the herb plants are going to be my first go-to plant. You can definitely grow, the culinary type, herbs in those spaces in order to have something growing in there. But the really interesting thing is that a lot of plant hybridizers and plant growers have taken some of the best characteristics of our culinary herbs and made them more ornamental plants. So they're ornamental herbs as well as culinary herbs that you can grow in that space. It's going to handle it really well. A lot of our native grasses and native wildflowers are going to handle that situation as well. So those would be my go-to plants for that inferno strip: the native grasses, native wildflowers, and then the Mediterranean herbs. And a lot of those will stay under that 2 feet height so that you have that sightline clearance for traffic in the area. And then I'm planning to use red clover to sow from seed as a cover crop. Will this be good for pollinators? Yes, absolutely. The seed I ordered says it's nitrogen coated. Will this hurt insects? No, it will not. So a lot of things in the clover family, nitrogen from the air into the soil. And in order to give those plants a boost into being able to do that, they have to be paired with a beneficial bacteria. And so this nitro coating is really a type of bacteria that helps the clover fix nitrogen from the air into their root system. And so that's how a lot of our clovers benefit the soil. But they also won't cause any impact to the pollinators themselves. So it's going to be a win-win all the way around if you want to seed them in that way. And I think that's all of the questions, not unless anybody wants to type in something to add to that. Well, and here's my contact information. If you have any other questions that come up along the way, feel free to email me. Mine's the one on the right, Kathleen Cue, kq2@unl.edu. Thanks for your attendance and your support of pollinators. I really appreciate it. It's something that we can do to make a big difference.
Thank you, Kathleen. All that information was incredible. I think I'm gonna watch it again just to try and get down how much knowledge you had to put out. Thank you.